Hi, I'm Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University, and this video lecture is on critical thinking in the online class participation format. The purpose of this lecture, it's primarily for graduate students, and it's being designed for classes that I teach. However, it's also applicable to graduate students in other programs, may be applicable to undergraduate students, and even to some people just participating in online forums and places like Facebook might find aspects of this helpful. A primary purpose is to help students improve their participation in online class forums so that they can get good grades and also benefit from the classroom participation. I find the ways that students approach their participation in online formats often has a big impact about whether it is experienced as busy work and they benefit little from it, or whether they benefit a lot from it. I think it has less to do about the requirement and more to do about the way the students approach it typically. And also, the primary purpose is to facilitate healthy discussions in online classrooms. When the discussions get too much focused on debate or conflict, or people are not really taking them seriously and keeping up, then it impacts everyone in the class, and it's a less helpful experience. And so I'll talk some about how to facilitate healthy classroom discussions. A secondary purpose is just to encourage good communication skills online in general. No one is perfect in their online communication skills, and online communication is still something relatively new for most people, and so we're still learning a lot about online communications and how to do it. Just a little bit about my background. I've been teaching graduate school for over 10 years, also have taught some in undergraduate school, and for the majority of that time I've always had classes that frequently had at least some online participation component to it, and also have taught some classes that are more purely online. So I've been doing this for a while, have learned some from it, often painfully from mistakes and other experiences in learning how to facilitate these, and in many ways still am learning. Just a disclaimer too, different professors have different expectations about communication. And I'll try to speak to some of the variances, but I will focus largely on what I expect in class. Most of this will be transferable to other situations, even if slightly adapted. However, some of it will be more specific to my classes too. This is just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. There'll be a slide for each of these. We'll do a brief overview of critical thinking. However, I talk much more about critical thinking in another online lecture that I've done that's available on YouTube on critical thinking and professional writing. So if you want more details on critical thinking, I would encourage you to check out that, and the critical thinking is towards the beginning if you're just interested in that aspect of it. I will talk a little bit about framing online communication, emotion and tone, checking assumptions, dialogue versus debate, giving credit, what to say, how much to say, and when to say it. Now, first, in this brief overview of critical thinking, I would like to really stress critical thinking, and the same thing is true with critiquing, is not just being critical. This is the most common mistake that people have when approaching critical thinking in general. But critical thinking is not just being critical. And a matter of fact, if you're just being critical, if you're just looking for problems and weaknesses, that often reflects a lack of critical thinking and provides evidence for it. So there may be some critiquing. Sometimes critical thinking doesn't have any elements of being critical hardly at all. So please be sure and keep that as a primary frame of reference. I think that's particularly important when we're talking about online discussion, because being too critical will quickly derail the discussions. What critical thinking is doing, it's including your own perspective. And, I find some students get in the habit of just summarizing the thoughts of others in their posts. That's not showing good critical thinking. I need to be able to see your voice to know that you're utilizing critical thinking in the online classroom. So be sure and include your own voice. Identifying strengths and weaknesses. And sometimes there's more strengths than weaknesses, sometimes more weaknesses than strengths. But it's important to be thoughtful about these. And particularly when you're thinking about the online forum, when we're discussing and critiquing possibly each other's ideas, you're going to have much more success if you identify more strengths and weaknesses. Maybe you pick and choose the weaknesses you're going to speak to, because that will help facilitate a more positive discussion and more openness to the critiques that you do bring forward. So it is identifying strengths and weaknesses, but then being selective about how and when to introduce those. Being aware of one's own bias and limitations is extremely important, that we're critiquing ourselves as well. And I think it's generally helpful to acknowledge these, particularly when approaching from kind of a humanistic or existential perspective. I think it's really important to own our biases. Examining assumptions. And this includes one's own, but part of what we do in critical thinking is we look at what are the assumptions. Is there more of a traditional rational, scientific type assumptions that are the basis of an argument, or is it based on one's own experience? Where are the assumptions coming from? This can also be talked about as an implicit epistemology, but looking at assumptions, your own and the assumptions of others, and considering those, clarifying those can be important. Considering the sources, particularly when appealing to sources to advance the discussion, are they good scholarly sources that are being utilized? Are they sources that have been vetted and peer-reviewed? Are they sources that are intended for a professional audience? This is important to consider when looking at sources. Comparing to other ideas can be a great way of critical thinking without necessarily being critical at all, but just comparing and contrasting. For example, the program that I'm developing this for is a humanistic and existential program. And to compare humanistic and existential approaches to psychodynamic approaches or to cognitive or behavioral approaches, even different approaches within humanistic and existential, that can be great ways to show your critical thinking and that you understand the ideas. Integrating with other perspectives, so integrating it into other perspectives in psychology or other disciplines, talking about how ideas fit together, how they can enhance each other. These can be great ways of utilizing critical thinking. And also thinking about how do you apply these? How would you apply these in the real world? How would you apply these in your life? How would you apply these in your career, your profession, or different roles that you're in professionally? Going to application, that can be an important part of critical thinking. Now, not all of these are used each time that you critically think, but if you can consider a couple of these, and each time that you're trying to utilize critical thinking in online discussions, I think you're going to find that you have much more success in demonstrating critical thinking. And again, keep in mind, critically thinking applies equally to one's own ideas and assertions as to others. And it's all good critical thinking always includes self-reflection. And you may find that sometimes you're in a discussion and you go through and you advocate for a position, and after the discussion and thinking about it more, you disagree with yourself and what you said back at the beginning. That's great. Note that. Those are some great examples of how you can demonstrate critical thinking. Okay, framing online discussions. There are different frames that people will bring to the classroom discussions. For me, I generally use this first one, which I think is the most common in my experience, in that it's extending or replacing discussion in the classroom. So if you're in a purely online class, this may be the way to have something that is similar to that discussion that you have in the actual classroom. Other times, I've taught classes, for example, that have met every third weekend, and so having some discussion in between has been very helpful in facilitating discussions in between the in-person discussions. So this is a way to keep that dialogue going, to clarify ideas, to bring in different perspectives about ideas. For me, one of the most rewarding parts, actually the most rewarding part of teaching regularly, is the discussions. That's when it becomes alive. That's when I learn and grow while students are learning and growing. And I know most professors feel the same way. To just go back through the same knowledge from books and lectures over and over again without seeing different ways to perceive it, to apply it, to think about it, really gets quite boring. So classroom discussions make it more lively for the professor and for the students, and this is typically what the online discussions are doing. And so if you bring that frame of reference, that it's similar to what you're doing when you're sitting in a classroom discussing, that can often be helpful. Now, some professors use the online discussion more as an open forum for essay style questions or even exam style questions. And so often the professors will ask a specific question and expect each student to answer it in their own way. That's going to be a little bit different, a little bit more of a formal style of that. And so getting a sense for what approach your professor takes there is important, and sometimes you may ask. Now, unfortunately, some professors still will often use online participation just as busy work that need to count for some more hours in the classroom, and so they assign it as busy work. This is really unfortunate. I promise you, if you take a class from me, the participation will never just be busy work. And sometimes students will still use it that way, but that's never my intention. It's always to be something that is contributing to the class, contributing to the advancement of knowledge. Emotional tone in online communication. I think a lot of people have some recognition of this, at least on an unconscious or and probably preconscious level, and for most people even conscious. But we generally are not very good at interpreting tone in online communication, and even therapists tend to be not very good at interpreting tone. There was some research a while back. I haven't been able to find this when I've tried to look it up. I haven't spent a lot of time, but it was talked about in the APA Monitor several years ago that suggested that people are no better than chance at interpreting tone in emails. So this is really something that we need to be aware of. Some of this is due from the lack of nonverbals, the lack of context. Some people may be writing late at night for their participation when they're really tired and sleepy. Others may be doing it during breaks at work or at the end of a long day at work, while others may be doing it as they're in the middle of the day and they don't have work or other things to distract them. So there's all these very different contexts that people are bringing to it, and the lack of nonverbals, the lack of a more synchronous discussion. All of these things contribute to some of the confusion. Many people tend to be more aggressive and less respectful in their online communication. And so this can also contribute to some of the problems. And there's a tendency to interpret tone as stronger and more intense than what is intended. So, for example, someone may state very mildly that they were bothered by something, and it might be interpreted as, wow, this was really a huge disagreement and a huge problem. So it's good to be aware of that there's a tendency for most people to interpret tone and intensity as being stronger than what it was actually intended. So some suggestions then. For one, avoid sarcasm in online communication. This is a pretty good general rule. There are exceptions, particularly if you know someone well and you're quite certain that they're going to be aware that it's sarcasm. But in online communication in a class, I would encourage you to not use sarcasm at all. And be careful with humor. And when you're using it, it's often good to be explicit, to say, this is just, this was intended as humor. Because again, people misinterpret things pretty regularly in this online format. Humor, you can probably get away with much better on Facebook than you can in an online classroom, particularly if it's not people that you know well. So if you're not in a classroom with people that you know well, I would just avoid humor altogether, just like sarcasm. Be aware that really short messages are often interpreted as being terse or critical, even if that was not the intent. It's some people just get bombarded with email and mass communication, and will get in the habit of very short messages. There's times where I will do this. We'll send very short messages just because I'm quite busy, and unfortunately, these often get interpreted as being terse or critical when that wasn't the intention. Again, this is that misinterpretation of the tone that often happens. So it's often better to take a little more time and write things out instead of being overly short. With text messaging, with Twitter and all of this, a lot of people are getting in the habit of these very short posts. But be careful with that, and again, be more careful in an online classroom as opposed to when you're posting on Twitter or Facebook. This is a different context, and people are going to have different expectations and may not know you as well. It's generally good to reread your post before posting, especially if you're emotional or you're tired when you're posting it. And post when you have time to think through your response is generally a wise idea too. Check assumptions then. If you because of the likelihood of misinterpretation and content tone and intensity with these online communications, if you find yourself offended about someone's post, clarify before reacting. Just you can come back and say, can you clarify what you meant by this? Is it this? Or I interpreted it as this. Was that accurate? Or even sometimes saying, I was bothered by what you said, but I'm not sure I'm understanding appropriately, and clarifying. All of these could be much more helpful than just responding from that place of being offended or upset about someone's post. Often you'll find out that it's just a misunderstanding. Sometimes you'll find out it was what was intended, and then again, you might want to take a little time and think through how you're going to respond in a way that's going to be respectful and not incite a conflict. And then be aware of when it's going to be more appropriate to respond in the forum versus back channel. So back channel is emailing them or messaging them, or in a less public format. And if you're really bothered by something, it's often best to message the person or email them back channel instead of confronting them online to try and work through things. Dialogue versus debate. In the classroom, dialogue is generally preferred to debate, and if you're in a class with me, it's always preferred to debate. I don't find debate to be something that's very useful in most situations because of the approach. Dialogue, I think, is much better for advancing things, particularly in an academic setting. Debate will often stifle ideas, it will often stifle creativity, whereas dialogue will enhance this quite often. So debate, there's often a winner and loser mentality, trying to be perceived as the winner, as the person that was smarter, as the person that got the best of the debate. Debate often really focuses on power, who's in the position of power or authority, and so there will be different ways to try and claim power, which I'll talk about a little bit here in a minute. And it's often trying to assert one's approach over the other as being better than, if not the right one. Dialogue is different. It disagrees with respect and appreciation for differences. It doesn't see the differences as something where one is better than the other. They're different. And we can explore both of them and consider that both of them may be better for different people or different contexts. It's more of a collaborative approach where we're working together to advance the ideas in discussion, and it seeks to incorporate, integrate, and share ideas and approaches. So often we may take ideas from both sides and put them together. Sides probably is not even the best word there. From both people or all people participating in the discussion, we might put them together to strengthen the overall idea and advance together, and each person may take a different version of that. But the idea is to work together, work collaboratively and respectfully in a dialogue, and I think this is generally much better in a classroom setting. Now, what creates the shift from dialogue to debate? Often being critical. I'm going to keep coming back to this. When you just focus on being critical, that's generally going to encourage a debate style of conversation. Not acknowledging strengths while focusing on weaknesses. Again, I mentioned before, try and balance those strengths and weaknesses. Even, if you're in an online discussion and you find one of your peers states something and you find 5 big weaknesses and 2 big strengths, you might just pick one of those weaknesses to focus on and then talk about the 2 strengths as well. And you might find that you have that you're much more effective in having a good conversation and dialogue if you're able to do that. We don't have to point out every weakness or problem, and often when we do, they're not going to be heard. Claiming to be objective, that again, my bias is towards the humanistic and existential, and I don't really think we're able to be purely objective. We're always going to have some bias in there, but claiming to be objective or claiming to sources that are proclaimed as being objective often starts to shift things to a debate style. Appeals to being power over. This is what I was referring to before. It's often done by claiming authoritative sources. So, well, I'm gonna cite Rollo-May because Rollo-May is always right, and so by citing Rollo-May, I'm going to be correct. Now you can talk about Rollo-May, in a way saying, this was Rollo-May's position. I tend to like this and agree with this. It's a little different than this other position. Or you can say, well, I don't agree with that. Relevance states, and really assertive. So the way that you appeal to these authoritative sources can really impact whether you're going to move forward in a dialogue or towards a debate. On claiming roles, titles, or experience. Now, this can be helpful in a dialogue too, to talk about, well, I've had this background and it helps me perceive things in this way. That can be part of just owning up to your biases, or it can be done in a way that is saying, well, I'm really the authority on this. Again, a lot of it is about the way you say it. When you state, well, I'm so and so, this has been what I've learned, or this is from this position, this is what I know, versus saying, well, my experience in this role is, talking about your experience and what your experience brings to that. So again, be careful in how you claim roles, titles, and experience, and talk about that. And then another thing that's often done in some discussions that shifted towards a debate is using questions to corner someone. You're using questions to draw out their argument, and then when they say something that you're kind of leading them to say, then no, this is not correct and this is why. Well, that just creates an environment of suspicion. It's often leading and misleading, and so it's not very helpful. Ways to maintain dialogue then. Always try to see strengths when discussing weaknesses. I've talked about that plenty. Appreciate the differences and state it. Sometimes you might say, listen, I see this differently, but I really appreciate your perspective, and I can see how it'd be valuable in certain situations, and be specific about those. That can really help keep the dialogue going. Clarifying with curiosity. This is that opposite of question. So putting the questions out there, and if there's kind of a little bit of an environment of suspicion already, then you might just be clear about why you're asking that question. I'm curious about this. My perspective is this. I'm wondering what your perspective is. That's you're kind of wording things in a way to say up front that it's okay to have a different perspective. Balancing the positive and negative of disagreeing, I've talked about, and disagreeing assertively but respectfully. Dialogues are not denying disagreement, and when everyone is just trying to act as if they agree, even when they may not, that's not really being respectful. It's not being genuine or authentic either. It's good to be able to disagree, but to do it in a respectful way, and talking about different perspectives and opinions. Giving credit. Giving credit's important. It's a part of critical thinking, is identifying our sources and talking about where they come from, and making sure that they are appropriate level sources for the type of discussion that we're having. But how to give credit often is going to vary in accordance with the frame. We talked some about that frame before. If the frame of the online discussion is more of an essay or test frame, then it's probably best to cite it in APA style. Putting the citation in there and having a reference list at the end of your post that has that information quite specifically in there. If it's more of a classroom frame, then you might cite it more informally. Let me give some examples of that. And again, APA style, you would use it like you would in a scholarly paper and reference at the end. And if your professor is not specific about what they expect in this, I generally would just ask them up front about what they prefer. The more informal styles, this is what I prefer, is doing A or B here in the informal styles. I think generally are the best. Rolame and the Cry for Myth advocates and don't have a reference section. I know by saying Rolame and the Cry for Myth what you're talking about. Or Rolame and the date and the title advocates no reference section. That's generally my preference. That's more of what you see in the classroom discussion. That I want you to be able to talk a little bit more freely, not in the online discourse, not to focus on talking like you would in a paper, because the discussions, the interactions, when they're a little bit more free in that sense, we can play around with ideas. I don't expect that everything that you put on an online discussion is going to be your final position. Often you may be just thinking through an idea, and you're getting feedback, getting different perspectives. That's great. And when you try to write too scholarly, that stifles that. So I think there's a great advantage in having multiple styles of communication in a class. And so I will typically have a scholarly paper and then discussions as different ways of communicating and working through and thinking through ideas in classrooms, and I find that to be helpful. And some professors are fine with just saying, Rolla May says. I'm okay with you doing that sometimes. If you can't remember which Rolla May book you got this from and you've read 5 of his books, that's fine. Just say, it was Rolla May, I believe, who said in one of his books, da da da. That's okay. Now, when you're quoting, always be clear that it's a quote yet. Put it in quotations. You maybe don't have to put all the reference information like you would in APA style, but be clear in that it is a quote, that it is someone else's exact words, and whose words they are. Okay, just a couple things left here. What to say. Now, in your participation, there's generally several things you want to do. And again, this is something you might want to check out with your professors. This is very true to pretty much any time I'm going to have online participation expected in my classes. Demonstrate that you have watched, listened to, attended the course lectures. So if it's a hybrid course where you're in class and not in class, be sure that you've been at the lectures and show that you were awake, paying attention, and thinking about the material. If it's a distance learning class, show that you've watched and listened to. So you might want to make reference to them, show that you're familiar with the ideas. Now, my experience is that if you have not, well, let me just wait on that. The same is true with the reading. Make sure you've done the reading. And if you're a little behind, you might want to acknowledge that in your post. Because one of the things that is, in my experience, very obvious is when you start engaging in the discussion, if you have not done the lecture materials, not done the reading, it's very evident when you start posting. Often people will post about an idea, referencing it to someone else or citing it as if it was their own new idea, and it was right there in the course lecture or the course reading. So I would guess that the vast majority of the time, if people aren't doing the majority of the course reading and lectures, it's obvious. And so you want to, in your participation, make reference to the things, show that you've been doing it, and that's going to bode well in your participation. I'm going to take that into consideration when grading you. If you do not demonstrate to me that you've done the course readings, even if you have, you're going to lose some points for that. And the same thing is true with the lectures. If you don't demonstrate to me that you've done those, you're going to lose some points for that. Show critical thinking. So don't just show that you've listened to them, but think about them. One thing that is never acceptable in my classes is to have posts that are just summarizing other people's thoughts, particularly if it's something in the required reading or the lecture. That if you do that, you can expect that you'll likely get a message from me saying, please make sure to integrate your own thoughts. The post that you did make was not, I'm not going to give you credit for that. I'm not going to give you full credit for that because what you primarily did was just summarize other people's thoughts. I want to see that you are actually integrating your own thought and critical thinking in there. So that should be a part of anything. Don't summarize. Let me say that again. Don't summarize in your online participation. I would just, to add one more thing to that, there is nothing more boring than to, as a professor and also as a student in a class, is to just read through a number of different people summarizing the same things that you've already had to read. It really has no utility to me, and so avoid that. Make sure that you're advancing the discussion. Say something that others have not said. So again, don't just repeat the same thing that others have said. Don't just say, hey, great idea. I liked what you said there. That really impacted me. You can say those things, but say more than that. Bring something of yourself in there. Advance the discussion. Every post that you make should advance the discussion, should bring something new to it, if you want it to count towards your participation requirements in particular. Another thing you can do is connect it to your professional goals or how you would apply this in your life or career. That's where I think the discussion really gets exciting a lot of times, is when you can take an idea and say, oh, this is how I would apply it there. This is how I'd apply it in my life. This is how I'd apply it in my career. Or, wow, this makes me think back on something I did before and maybe I would have done it differently. Those are where a lot of times it gets quite exciting. So you're connecting the required materials, lectures and reading, and you're connecting it to your professional life. That's a very important skill, particularly when you're in graduate school, to be able to translate this knowledge, and a lot of times these abstract ideas, into what you're actually going to do. And participation is one of the primary ways that you do that. So you've got to, again, connect it to the material, but have something of yourself. So what to say? Always connect it to the course material and connect it to something with yourself. Avoid excessive fluff is another thing that's critical, or non-substantive post. Especially if this is also sent by email. A lot of times classroom discussions are something that we'll post online, but then also we'll send an email. And if this is the case and you do a lot of, wow, that was a great post, even if you're not expecting that to count as your participation post, well, then people are getting badgered with all these different emails. My suggestion would be to really limit those. If you sometimes might have this feeling, I really appreciated that, I just want to say that, that's fine. But if you find yourself doing that a lot, if you find yourself doing that, once or twice a week, or even once or twice every couple of weeks, that's probably too much. 95% of your posts should be substantive. I'd prefer 100%, but sometimes people are just really struck by an idea and want to say something. That's fine, as long as it's not too much of a pattern. Be careful with self-promotion. I don't see this often in the classroom. Sometimes you see it on Facebook where people are just constantly promoting their stuff. That's not great. If you're in a class and you have a success related to the class material, or even just related to your career, and you want to post something about it, that's great. It doesn't have to be connected to the course material necessarily. Even it doesn't have to count towards your participation, but maybe you just want to note, hey, I just had a journal article accepted. That's great. But don't overdo it. I really appreciate it when my peers, when they publish an article or a book, when they post something on a listserv or on Facebook, I really appreciate that they let me know, because often I'm interested in going out and reading that, or at least I'm interested in knowing it's there, and I like to congratulate them for that. So that's great. But when it's over and over and over just being put there, it's that over self-promotion tends to be more of a turn-off than anything, particularly for people that are a little bit more established or focusing on other things. So it's great to share some of your successes. Most of you are going, if you're in graduate school, are probably going to be active in your professional work relevant to things in the classroom. Sharing some of those things can be great. Sometimes you can even do it connecting it to the course content in a substantive post. But be careful about overdoing it. And so, in one way of saying this is, remember, classrooms are not Facebook, but even there, I find that a lot of people on Facebook really announce things well, and then there's a lot of people that just really overdo it in a way that's more of a turnoff than anything. So keep in mind where you're posting here. How much to say? Now, this is something a lot of people will ask regularly in classrooms. I would suggest generally 2 to 3 paragraphs per original post. I will distinguish typically in online classrooms between original post, which is something you're introducing a new idea. Often it's a new thread. And then comments or responses to a post. So original one, I would suggest you generally want it to be 2 to 3 paragraphs, the paragraphs generally being 4 to 8 sentences long. A response post, I would generally suggest 1 to 2 paragraphs. Now, sometimes you can go a little longer. If you're really good at writing concise, you might be able to go a little bit shorter than that. But rarely is a original post, if it's not 2 to 3 paragraphs, is it going to be substantive enough really to be contributing and advancing the conversation too much. Sometimes you can do this in one really strong paragraph, but more often 2 to 3 is going to be your ideal. Similarly, some people will try and have a substantive response in 1 or 2 sentences. It's generally not going to do it and really advance the conversation. So that's a general guideline, but again, keep in mind that's going to vary from writing style to writing style some. If you write too long, you're going to aggravate your peers, and your peers probably aren't going to read it, and you may aggravate your professor. I don't mind some longer ones, but if everything that you're writing is a mini paper, that would be 3 to 4 pages of reading, that is overdoing a little bit. So keep in mind that too long is not very helpful. Too short, again, you're not going to demonstrate that you've done the course requirements in critical thinking. A general suggestion on how frequently, basically, to post. Um, do more than the minimum requirement at least some weeks. I'll typically, depending upon the class and the size of the units, require that there's either 1 to 3 original posts per unit of study. If each week you just do the bare minimum, that's something that's noticeable. And if some of those are weak, which is likely going to be true in a class over time, well, then that's going to impact your grades some. Putting a couple extra posts in shows that you're engaged in the class. It also helps to account if you have 1 or 2 posts, maybe on a topic that you're not quite as interested in, that's not as strong. Well, it's going to help balance that out so you can still get a good grade. So I would do at least a little bit more than the minimal requirement on the original posts. But on original ones, I wouldn't do too much more than required. On response posts, it's much easier to not have to worry about over responding as long as they're substantive. If you're doing your minimum on the substantive and then a lot of these fluff, well, again, that's going to be a problem. But many people are just really engaged in the conversation, really learn from the dialogue and discussion. So if the minimum requirement is 2 or 3 response posts for a unit, and you end up doing 15, I wouldn't worry about it much. If they're substantive and they're focused, if each of those are again are getting to be 2-3 pages long, that's a little too much. But if you're really engaged in the dialogue and like to do a little bit more on those responses, that's generally going to be something that's okay. And then when to say it. The biggest thing, would say, is keep up on your posts for a few reasons. One, when you get behind on your post, it's not going to be as beneficial or meaningful to you. More than likely, it's just going to become busy work where you're trying to get it done before this semester is done. So it's a great way to take all the meaning out and transition it into basically something that's busy work. And when that's done, they're generally not as good a quality, they're not as thoughtful, they don't help you as much. But it's also less helpful to your peers, and it's difficult for your professor because it's out of context. When coming back and reading them, and often have to reread everything else to figure out where your response posts are. It often means that when you're behind, when the professor's got a lot of other papers to grade, all of a sudden now having to catch up on all of your posts that were late. So it's disrespectful to your professor and your peers not to keep up and posting on time, and it's not beneficial to you. So would strongly encourage you to really make sure that you keep up. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful to you in thinking about how to do your online participation. Again, I think this is something that can be very rich and meaningful if you approach it with the right attitude, and if it's something that you really engage with. But if you view it and have an attitude of it just as busy work, well, that's probably what it's going to become for you. So I would encourage you to give some thought and reflection about your posts, engage in it, and hopefully make the best of it. Thank you.